Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Marilyn Hamilton, and I'd like to welcome you to this session on the unity of everything, faith patterns in a planet of integral cities. I am joined today by two guests, Nishad Dubashia, who is the author of a very interesting approach to the unity of everything. His book will give you all of the details, but today we have the author with us, and also Peter Merry, who is the Chief Innovation Officer of Ubiquity University and did his dissertation on volution. So today we are having an exploration that I think relates to the planet of cities in a very interesting way. I have proposed there's 4 voices in the city. And there's the citizens, civic managers, the business innovators, and the 4th voice is the 3rd sector. I've often thought that the 3rd sector was actually an integrator voice for the city. And so in some ways today, that's one of the things that we're going to explore. I'm going to invite first Nishad to give us some background on the unity of everything that he has developed. And then I will invite Peter to share his insights into the Trinity of everything. And then I will thread this in and weave it into how I see it impacting the integral city. Then we'll have a little conversation about our 3 perspectives and invite in the audience. So if everyone is good to go, I'd like to thank you and invite Nishad to turn on his mic, and I will share my screen so that we can have our PowerPoints to back us up. There we go. So Nish, can you see that okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
So Nishad, would you like to tell us, to start with, how did you develop what you call the diamond model?
Thank you. I became interested in the different spiritual traditions around the world while I was a student. And after a few years of studying these traditions, I started to notice some strong commonalities between these different traditions. And I wanted to try to isolate what are the common features or the common elements that exist across these traditions. And that's after several years of reading and study, I was able to develop this model that I think is as simple as I could get it, containing all the elements that I think need to be there, and hopefully no superfluous elements, to really try to find this underlying universal pattern that seems to show up in different ways across the different traditions and also across various spiritual teachers through history and in recent times as well. And I was fortunate enough to be able to discuss the model with David Bohm, the physicist David Bohm. And that's what led to, much later, the writing of my book, which elaborates on this model in more detail.
Did you want to talk any more to this screen, Nishad, or would you like me to move to the next one?
Okay, no, I'll quickly go through the model just to give an explanation of what it signifies. So the best place to start would probably be 2 levels up, where it mentions what I refer to as multiplicity. Now, by multiplicity, I simply mean the world as we normally experience it. So this is the normal 3-dimensional world of space and time, of separate objects, including us as separate, apparently separate people. And one of the most important insights that seems to be there across the traditions, especially in the East, but also more implicitly in the Western traditions, is that there is a deeper underlying wholeness or deeper unity that underlies this multiplicity. which I'm referring here to as the whole. And so the totality of reality can be seen as this interplay between the whole and the parts, or the unity and the multiplicity. One of the problems, or perhaps the key problem that we face in the world today, is that we've lost sight of this underlying unity or this underlying wholeness. And when we do that, these different parts that make up multiplicity become what I refer to. In fact, I'm borrowing terminology from David Bohm here. The parts become what I'm referring to here as fragments. So fragmentation occurs when this multiplicity is divorced in our perception from the underlying whole. And it's that fragmentation that leads to all kinds of problems and difficulties in the world. So a very quick example is the division of the human race into different races. Now, when we can talk about the human beings made up of different races in a non-problematic way, but when we take that division too far, we lose sight of the underlying wholeness of humanity, then our different races become fragments, and this can lead to all kinds of unnecessary conflict between different races. Now, one of the questions I discussed here with David Bohm, and it's prevalent here in throughout the traditions, is how exactly does the whole actually become the parts? How does the whole manifest as multiplicity? And many of the traditions talk about an intermediate stage of development, a stage of reality, a level of reality, which is often referred to as the subtle level of reality. And one of the things that happens here at the subtle level is that a division is made between the subject and the object, or between each one of us as a separate entity and the rest of the world. So we separate ourselves off from the rest of reality and create this subject-object dualism. And then that dualism and the difference distinction making, which needn't be problematic, continues to generate further and further parts, which leads to the generation of multiplicity. So we have a process here, if you like, where the whole separates apparently into subject and object manifest as multiplicity, and we then take multiplicity too far to generate fragmentation. But from an ultimate point of view, an ultimate, what we could call an enlightened point of view, there is no real difference even between the whole and the parts. They're also really two aspects of the same non-dual reality. And that non-dual reality is what I'm referring here as to the ground, which is the non-duality between all aspects of existence, the whole, subject, object, multiplicity, even fragmentation, ultimately are not separate from one another. Now, this process of manifestation whereby the whole becomes the parts and the parts, unfortunately, in our perception become fragments, I've referred to here as creation. And the process in which we can rediscover the underlying whole and heal our fragments, I'm referring here to as evolution. So that, I think, is a very quick summary of this diamond model, which is this universal pattern that I began to see across the different traditions.
Thanks, Nishad. Let's move on to the next slide. And so you can give us a little bit more detail around David Bohm's perceptions.
Okay, yes, thank you. So this is, if you like, the diamond model applied to the work of David Bohm. So David Bohm refers to this underlying wholeness as the implicate order. So this is the underlying order that we can't normally see. It's beyond our sensory perception. It's beyond our ability to clearly conceptualize. It's this underlying wholeness that is implicit, if you like, in the more explicit order of things and events that we see, which David Bohm referred to as the explicate order. And the intermediate separation between the implicate order and the explicate order is the arisal or emergence of mind and matter as two apparently separate or relatively autonomous subtotalities within the larger totality of the implicate order. So there is a separation apparently between mind and matter, which then generates the explicate order. And again, if we take the explicate order too seriously and lose sight of the implicate order, that generates fragmentation. And even beyond the separation between the implicate and the explicate is this non-dual wholeness, this non-dual union of everything, the unity of everything, which is what David Bohm refers to as the ground. So we have a process of emergence whereby the implicate becomes the explicate, and a process of dissolution whereby the explicate is, if you like, reabsorbed into the implicate. And David Bohm talks about this process of emergence and dissolution happening in each moment. It's not a historical thing that's happened over millions of years. It's actually happening in each moment. And every time there are changes in the explicate, that is, if you like, fed back into the implicate. So the implicate and the explicate evolve together, and we contribute to that evolution through our own behavior and our own actions.
This is a beautiful pattern that he discerned and has become known by many people, but I think that you've discerned it and started to look at it across the faith traditions and discovering the unity in everything. One of the first places that you shared this with me was regarding the next slide, which is the integral theory. And this is often known as the theory of everything. So maybe you'd like to marry the two together, the unity and the theory of everything.
Yes, thank you. So I'm drawing here on the work of Ken Wilber primarily, which itself is a synthesis of the traditions and thinkers around the world. In the integral scheme here, we have three levels of reality that Ken Wilber talks about: the gross, the subtle, and the causal. So the gross corresponds to our multiplicity, the world of separate things which we can perceive through our senses. And the causal is the underlying oneness that underlies everything that exists. Now, in this scheme, this way of looking at things, we have the intermediate stage, which represents, if you like, what is between the causal and the gross, to talk of in that way, which Ken Wilber refers to as the subtle. And we have a separation between the subject and the object, that primary dualism, which we can think of as primary archetypes, take place or exist in that subtle realm. And we have the non-dual, which is the unification of all three realms: gross, subtle, causal. They're all really just different aspects of that same non-dual reality. Now, what's interesting here is that if we look at this interplay between the causal, the gross, the subtle, and the causal, the gross, the subject, and the object, we can, in very much more casual terms, if you like, refer to the causal as the one, the gross as the many, or the individual and the collective. We can refer to the subject as the interior. We can refer to the object as the exterior. And if we see the interplay between these four, we actually generate what Ken Wilber talks about as the four quadrants. So when we have the interior with the one, we have the I, which is the first person. When we have the interior against the many, we have the we, which is the second person. When we have the exterior against the one, we have the it, which is the third person. And when we have the exterior against the many, we have the its, which is the fourth person. And anyone who's familiar with integral theory will see this as absolutely foundational to Ken Wilber's work. And again, if we lose ourselves in the gross, in the many, and lose sight of the underlying wholeness, that can lead to all kinds of pathologies and problems, which very generally I'm referring here to as shadow. And the process whereby the causal becomes the subtle, becomes the gross, if you like, is referred to as involution, which borrows from the teachings of Aurobindo, the Indian sage. And the reverse process, which we can participate in through spiritual practice and development, we have the gross moving into the subtle, moving back into the causal, which we can refer to here as evolution. So we see that here quite a good, strong correspondence between the diamond model and important aspects of integral theory.
Thanks, Nishad. This is probably something that wove the three of us together and originally attracted us to notice that we had overlapping views of, in your case, the unity of everything. In my case, looking at the cities through what I call map 5, which I'll speak of in a few minutes. And then Peter, who looked at something in between involution and evolution that he called volution. So I'm going to stop sharing this slide set, and I'm going to invite Peter to come online and to share with us what he calls the Trinity of everything.
Thank you, Marilyn. Yeah, and you know, Nishad and I have explored this through many hours, the relationships between our two ways of thinking. In fact, we even set up a whole YouTube channel where I think, how many have we got up there? 6, I think, at the moment, Nishad, 6 dialogues. So you'll probably notice some connections here, but the interesting thing is that they emerged independently. So let me see. All right. So essentially, this has come out of an inquiry that I was in for a number of years for my PhD research at the Wisdom School at Ubiquity University. And this is a part of what then became volution theory and my quest to try to understand, you know, how does it all fit in a way that can explain more of reality than our current theories do. And this is the basic thesis that underlies this Trinity dynamic that I'm seeing. And it was only after discovering this and then listening to all sorts of people talk about the different religions that I realized this pattern was reflected through those religions and spiritual traditions. So firstly, if we're looking out at the world and we see different entities, we see that each entity has a boundary field, something that bounds it. It's what defines it. Which I'm referring to as its unified field, created by the original impulse for the entity that transcends yet includes every part of the entity. So like a holon, it's a whole, and lots of parts, each of those parts are their own whole, etc. So it's got a boundary. It's got an aspect that we can perceive with our 5 senses. So let's say you know, you're looking at a person, they have their identity as the person, they have the things we can see with our 5 senses. And there is an aspect of reality existing between their identity as a whole, which goes beyond just their physical being, and the physical being. So a dynamic that exists between this boundary field, let's say, and the actual thing we can perceive in the material world. So this is kind of at the most abstract level, and I'll explain how this plays out in a sec. Now, what's important to notice is that a unified field is different to the absolute oneness. So this is a distinction in my language I was using in the same way that Nishad was making a distinction between non-dual and whole. Unified field is equivalent to the whole, and absolute oneness is equivalent to the non-dual in the language that I was using here. So the form within which that I was sensing reflects best the dynamics of life was this toroidal form with these 3 elements where you've got a creative tension between a seed and a possibility, and that creates this boundary field or this surface brain within which the 90-degree plane, the material reality manifests, as here with this galaxy. And this is my kind of 2D flattening of that image, that you've got this container, this boundary, you've got the manifest world, and then you've got dynamics going on between the manifest and the container. And this is, if you think of it, this is a torus. You see the lines going like this, a kind of 2D in a way image of a torus. Yeah, there we go, like that. So what's going on is that you've got this dynamic interaction, breathing of every entity, every being going on between its field and its manifestation, breathing in and out like this. So you've got the container, that has been referred to in various ways, the absolute or the one or the unified field, the Black Madonna in some traditions. You've got the boundary you could also refer to as the soul of an entity, because from the kind of new physics perspective, on the boundary field of any entity, all the information exists about that entity. It becomes more refined as the entity grows over time, but the information is held on the boundary field of the entity that, remember, is like a toroidal field. So it's got the outside, but it also comes right into the center and back out again. So you can think of that as its potential. Its potential is to manifest all that information into reality, hence its soul. And the manifest world is obviously referred to as the many in the Christian tradition, the Son, right, or the Christ-Mary relationship, if you add in the feminine that's so often missing. And then the dynamics between the two are what we could call spirit, or the Shekinah, or the subtle energies. So in Wilber's language, the gross is the manifest and the many, the subtle is in the dynamics, and the causal is at the field level. So this, I'll need to move our videos here for me to be able to see this. This image from Anne, a quote from Anne Baring really summarizes it nicely. I'll just have to skip through it again to get there. Where she says, even now, the cosmic information template holds within it the design of the process of expansion and development of the universe as a coherent, unified entity, yet also facilitates the emergence of all kinds of possibilities as it expands. So the information template on the outside, right, the process of expansion and development going on, and the emergence of all the possibilities as it expands in the manifest. So just to go through each of these three and give you ideas of how they show up in different words, in different traditions. The container field as the soul, the Akashic field, morphogenetic field, information field, the implicate order that Nishad referred to, unmanifest Godhead Dharmaka, all these different names from different traditions are basically talking about this whole field, this unified field. But for the individual whose container it is, so each of us have one of these containers, right? We have a soul in a way. It's like being a fish in water. You can't see it or talk about it objectively because you are it. It completely encompasses you in every way, which is where we end up with art and poetry, like Rumi's here. You who know Jalaluddin, you the one in all, say who I am, say I'm you. In the material world, the manifest, the incarnational realms, matter, the many nodes in the web, the explicate order in Boehm's language, Nirmanakaya, the gross, etc. The child, that's basically the manifest reality that we can perceive with our five senses. So you have that as part of the Trinity. And in the Christian kind of Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, Father is the container, Son is the manifest, and Holy Ghost are the dynamics in between, the spirit movement. And this is that third element then, the dynamics. David Abraham describing how the Hopis see it, the manifested is that aspect of phenomena already evident to our senses, right? The material, while the manifesting is that which is not yet explicit, not yet present to the senses, but which is assumed to be psychologically gathering itself towards the manifestation within the depths of all sensible phenomena. So that's a great description of this kind of subtle dimension where things are coming through the subtle fields into the gross manifestation. So this was just some examples of different traditions who have explained things in different ways. And like, yeah, again, the kind of the Zoom stuff is in the way here of my slide. I don't know if I can get rid of it. Let me see, I might just have to come out of full screen. Where he says that the Tao begat one, one begat two, and two begat three, and three begat 10,000 things. So the Tao is this container, the Qing, the creative intelligence, and the Te, the organic growth in the manifest. Or from Plotinus, this then is how the material thing becomes beautiful by communicating in the thought, the reason or logos that flows from the divine. So the divine, the container, the thought, the dynamics, reason or logos, and the manifest, what he would call the material thing. Or from Walter Russell's work, three basic types of words. We see it back in the language where the container reflects in language words that express the concept of unity, wholeness, absolutes, absence of division into parts. The manifest words that express the concept of individuality or diversity in the presence of opposition, right, in polarity. And in the relationships, words that express the dividing or connecting lines that relate apparently separate parts to each other. So in Walter Russell described how the Trinity shows up in language, in the very different kinds of words that we use. And in the more kind of new science world, information, energy, and matter being the language that's used. So information stands for the immaterial field of reality. Matter is a manifestation of energy. Matter and energy result from the immaterial information fields on the boundary, right, and are an actualization of information. So information in this perspective is thus the most fundamental principle of existence. Neither matter or energy can exist without information, but information could exist without matter or energy. So you could have this field, but it might not be manifesting into anything. So now I could go on, and I did in my PhD dissertation. And at the evolutiontheory.org, you can find this table that you can't read at the moment that has all these different, the Trinity kind of played out in all these different traditions. So feel free to go there. There's a couple of sites you can find a bit more, evolutiontheory.net, or on my site, or Leading from the Field is the new book. So yeah, that's the universal Trinity in a nutshell.
Thank you, Peter. That's really impressive. And you always bring such beautiful art and crystallize the simplicity of the complexity. You really do, I think, find the simplicity on the other side of complexity in what you're doing. So now it's my turn to share what happened to me when I was working with the maps for Integral City. Not all of you may know those maps, but I have a map 5 that's about spirituality in the city. And when I drew that map, I was rather doubtful of it, wasn't really confident in sharing it a great deal. But as soon as I saw the unity of everything through Nishad's eyes, I went, oh my God, there's that map. And it is part of a universal pattern. And what I also loved about what Nishad had done was he located for me the difficulties of fragmentation and trauma in the city, which I didn't have embedded on the map. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen and show you the ways that I had taken this map 5 and started to work with it in regards to showing the ways that I think I'm going to have to probably go out of the full screen here. Stop share. I need to be able to show you the full size of the, otherwise it's just too difficult to read. Yeah, so I also developed a map, and why I wanted to be able to show this a little bit larger is because I have, I'll show you the upper left-hand quadrant of this if I can. Here. See if we can get it and show how it relates to what Nishad was showing us. So I started to think about the ground of being for me in map 5 was love. The unity I called source. So for many people, this would be God. I also, being a student of integral theory, saw the inner and the outer applications or manifestations of that. And in this case, looking at the upper left-hand quadrant, I started to think about this as the manifestation of beauty. What happens when that is not coherent or aligned? We have brokenness in the system. So what I'm showing you is actually not just one map 5, but I've got 4 versions of it here that relate to how I have been thinking about the master code of care. So the master code of care for me is how to care for self, others, place, and planet. And that for me is a way of bringing the manifestation of love into the city in ways that are scaled from self to others to place to planet. So when I was developing the map 5 with these ideas, I had created beauty, goodness, and truth as part of that map 5. And I thought, well, I think I'll just play with this a little bit more and scale down to see what would happen if we looked at those through self, others, place, and planet. So I just explained the one that shows beauty, and that would be related to the master code of care for self. So if we look at goodness, which is related to the master code of care for others, we start again with the ground of being, love. Source is still unity. And in this case, we're breaking the subject object into individual and collective. And the multiplicity is expressions of goodness. And I'm pointing to the brokenness or fragmentation as disrespect. That's how that turns up in the city. I didn't mention in the first version of looking at involution, beauty, that I'm also using involution and evolution as the cycle of the energies through map 5. So if we look at self and others on the left side of this map, then we can go and look at the right-hand side, and we see here truth. So here again, love as the ground of being, source as unity. And here I call this way of looking at place caring on the left and place making on the right. And that this is where I am locating truth. And what happens when we get fragmented is we get displaced, untruths, the whole arguments that we've been having with fact and not fact for the last couple of years. Again, involution and evolution flowing through this system. So we've got beauty, goodness, truth, and then in the 4th quadrant, this is where I have care of the planet. So still ground of being of love, source, as in this case, I'm saying the unity is Gaia herself, the planet. And in being able to think about how to locate the city in relation to the planet, I say city is on the left as the individual, and on the right, we have a planet of cities. So I've imagined for a long time that the system would be a whole planet of cities, that they would be connected like meridians, like acupuncture points across the city, across the planet. And that if we had a whole system, then we would manifest what I would think as Gaia's reflective organ system. So I borrowed this from James Lovelock, who said humans are Gaia's reflective organs. And when he said that, I said, oh, I think cities are the organs, organizations are the organelles, and the individuals are the cells in the system. So that's why I have these 4 scales of care for self, others, place, and planet. So the master code of care for the planet is in the 4th quadrant as I've imagined this. So if you look back then at the whole of this set, you see that I have taken Nishad's reframing for me of the city and thinking about how do we see in it beauty, goodness, truth, and a whole system, a planet of cities that we can hold together with caring for the city. So that's the way that I have used this way of developing map 5. And I have a further discussion at the end when we've gone back to some of what Nishad has explored for us in the faith systems in the city, because I'd like to talk a little bit about healing. One of the things that has always challenged me is when we look at spirituality in the city, how do we account for that which is fragmented, broken, is being held as, say, negative energy in the Akashic field? And I think that his map allows us to consider the possibilities of seeing that, recognizing it, and even healing it. But now I'd like to turn the slides back over to Nishad. And I want to say that as a preface to this section that he will cover, is that the other thing that I've really wondered a lot about in looking at cities is, if I think of the third sector, which holds the faith communities in it, the faith systems, how can they ever come to agreement with one another? Because it has been a condition for a long time that the different faith systems have not found it easy to coexist with one another. But I really found, again, a great revelation when Nishad shared his unity of everything, because he not only had extended this from his explorations of David Bohm and Krishnamurti, not to mention Peter Mary in the last little while, but he's gone on and looked at the whole of the faith systems. And so I'd like to invite you, Nishad, to come back on and take us through the different traditions that you have that show us, first of all, the Eastern traditions, then the Abrahamic traditions, and even atheism and scientific materialism. So I'll get you to start with the Eastern traditions, Nishad.
Thank you very much. Would it be possible to bring up the slide for the Eastern traditions?
Okay, I have it on my screen. You know what I forgot to do? I forgot to share it. So I'll bring it up. There we go.
Great, thank you very much. What I wanted to do was to show or to explore if this unity of everything diamond model can be applied not only to the work of, like Marilyn said, not only to the work of great recent thinkers like Bohm and Wilbur, but also to the religious traditions that have existed for thousands of years in many cases. So what I did is I tried to group the different traditions into three main groups, very roughly: the Eastern traditions, the Middle Eastern Abrahamic traditions, and then even the much more recent atheistic scientific materialist traditions, to see if this really does demonstrate, if there really is a unity between all of these. So I'll start off with the Eastern traditions, primarily Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. So here what we have is, if you look at the second line down, at the second aspect down, we have the formless, which corresponds to what I previously referred to as the whole. So the Eastern traditions tend to regard the underlying unity or the underlying wholeness as the realm of the formless, which is referred to as Brahman, emptiness, the Tao in these three traditions. And the formless manifests through a subtle realm into the world of form. So the world of form is our realm of multiplicity, our realm of different things and events, which again, Hinduism refers to as Leela, the play of God. Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, refers to as the Manovijñāna, which is the activity of the mind in creating distinctions. And Taoism refers to as the many, the one, or the Tao has become the many. And we have this intermediate realm, which is the subtle realm. And we have there this division into these primary archetypes of the subject and the object. In Hinduism, a very common way of talking about this primary dualism is Shiva and Shakti, which is the male and the female aspect of the divine. Or in Taoism, the much more well-known yin and yang, which is the inherent distinction or dualism that emerges out of the oneness of the Tao. Now, again, what we find is all these traditions talk about the possibility of human beings falling into delusion, some kind of delusion or illusion or suffering. And that takes place when this world of form is divorced in our perception from the underlying formless. And that's when we fall into this deluded state, because we're now not seeing reality in its totality, but only, if you like, the surface reality of form. And this is referred to in Hinduism as Maya, illusion. So Leela becomes Maya. It's referred to in Buddhism as the manas, which is where the thinking mind goes too far and creates distinctions that go on to create disharmony and suffering, or dukkha, which is the term in Buddhism for suffering. And in Taoism, when the many goes too far, we get too many, and that too many realm is out of harmony with the Tao or the way of things. We're not living in harmony with the Tao, and that is that is referred to as simply as disharmony. Now, underlying, if you like, all of this is the final, if you like, non-dual insight, enlightened insight, which is that the formless and the form are really not two. They're not really different from one another. Buddhism perhaps explains this the best, where it says emptiness is form, form is emptiness. There's no distinction between the two. And again, we have a process of involution whereby the formless manifests as the subtle, manifests as form, which in the human mind becomes delusion. And through spiritual practice, we can, if you like, reverse engineer this process. So form, we rediscover the subtle that underlies form, and eventually rediscover the formless. That is the true state that is the true underlying state of form. And finally, we discover the non-dual oneness, the non-dual wholeness of all three realms: the form, the gross, the subtle, and the causal, which is the formless. So we see this same pattern across the Eastern traditions in different languages, different cultural expressions, but that same universal pattern seems to be there in the East.
And so shall we move to the Western traditions then, or the Middle Eastern?
Yes, please.
There we go.
So in a way, the Eastern traditions were the easiest to map onto the diamond model. But if we're going to truly talk about a unity of everything, we need to incorporate the equally important Abrahamic traditions. So if you look here at the diagram, again, let's start with creation, which is two aspects up from the bottom. So creation, if you like, what God has created is the realm of multiplicity. This is the realm of form, separate things in space-time. Underlying creation at its root is the creator, the God, who is often seen as a personified creator. And God is referred to in these different traditions. I'm talking now of the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions. God is referred to here as Yahweh in Judaism, or Hashem in modern Judaism. In Christianity, God is referred to as the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In Islam, God is referred to as Allah. And God is the perfect wholeness, whether personified or not, that underlies creation, and that out of which creation emerged. And we have an intermediate realm, which is the realm of heaven and earth. I think the first verse in the Bible Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 is God, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So the first activity of God, the first emergence of wholeness is into this primary dualism, which we referred to earlier as subject and object. In the Abrahamic traditions, that first act of creation was the creation of the heavens and the earth. And together, the heavens and the earth make up creation. That makes up multiplicity. Now, the problem arises when creation and created creatures like human beings lose sight of God. We forget God, and we idolize or make an idol out of creation, and we forget God, and we live our lives apart from God. We live our lives in disobedience to God. And when we do that, creation falls into sin. Sin there corresponds to what is referred to as fragmentation in the diamond model. So sin is where creation has rejected God, and that causes all of the evil and all of the suffering in the world. Now, the Abrahamic traditions look forward to a time in their historical rendering of the story of the universe when God and creation will at some point in the future come back into perfect harmony. So this is referred to in Judaism as the promised land, in Christianity as the return of Jesus and the new creation, in Islam as the final judgment, and then the recreation of the cosmos in line with the will of Allah. So we look forward in these traditions to a time, or really it's really pointing to a realm that's already there in reality, even now, which is referred to in these traditions as paradise. And paradise is when God and creation live in perfect harmony with one another. So paradise corresponds to our non-dualism, our non-duality between the whole and the part. This is spoken of often in mythological terms, that one day Jesus will return and set the world to rights. But we can, in a more esoteric way, we can think of this as the non-dual wholeness that already exists between God and creation, but which we have lost sight of because we've fallen into sin. And the process whereby God creates the heavens and the earth, which becomes creation, is referred to as the process of creation. And the process whereby we rediscover God and realign our lives with God and move into paradise, find our place in paradise, rediscover the non-dual, is the process of salvation, which corresponds to what the Eastern traditions call evolution. So we can see here, again, a very clear correspondence with the diamond model, I think, and a real unity, which I think is not very commonly perceived between the Middle Eastern traditions and the Eastern traditions. Very different language, very different storytelling, but the same structure of reality underneath.
Thank you, Nishad. This is a beautiful way of exploring what I've observed in the city. So there's a third one now, and that is where there is, quote, no faith system except maybe scientific materialism. Can you walk us through this?
Yes, certainly. So yes, in fact, at Marilyn's suggestion, I thought I really should try to see if this structure corresponds in any way to the atheist tradition, which is a faith tradition of its own in a way, and modern scientific materialism. A growing number of people now in the modern world and postmodern world don't align themselves with any of these traditional spiritual traditions. So if we're really going to find a unity of everything, we need to find it as well in atheistic and scientific materialist views of reality. So here I try to draw a little bit on modern physics as well. So again, if we start with two aspects up from the bottom, we have reality, which is the world as we know it. So what we normally in our normal common day-to-day language refer to as reality is the world as we know it, which is multiplicity, the world of separate things and events. Ultimately, though, what reality is ultimately made of, what everything in the universe is ultimately made of, from a scientific point of view, is energy. Everything comes from and is made of pure energy. One example of this is the famous equation by Einstein, E equals mc squared. So all matter that has mass ultimately is a form of energy. It's made of energy. So the pure energy, which we can't perceive directly, but which underlies everything, corresponds to what we've previously referred to as the whole or wholeness. And this pure energy manifests as reality. The pure energy is perceived by us as reality, and indeed we are also part of that reality. Now, what's interesting here is what's the intermediate event or process that would correspond to our subtle realm, what we previously referred to as the subtle realm. Where is this subject-object dualism that generates reality? So again, from this more scientific point of view, at some point in evolution, sentient beings that are capable of sensation and perception evolve and become relatively independent agents with agency. So we have sentient beings with agency that are able to act and observe existence, which is essentially information that is sensed and perceived. And the best example of that is human consciousness. We are constantly engaged in an act or a process of acting upon and observing the information that we are surrounded by constantly. And our interaction with that information generates our experience of reality, which is the world as we know it. So again, here we have pure energy, which is wholeness, the subject and the object interacting through observation and interaction to generate reality as we know it. And that whole interaction between energy and reality is what we would loosely refer to as the universe, which is the ultimate reality in atheism and scientific materialism. Everything together constitutes the universe. Now, whereas in the scientific world, in the scientific worldview, that there's no real concept of sin or even delusion in the way that we see it in the spiritual traditions, there is certainly a concept of ignorance. And ignorance would be when we believe and act in ways that actually conflict with how reality really is. When we behave in ways or when we act in ways or believe in things that do not match with objective reality. That is what we would refer to in this worldview as ignorance. And examples that would commonly be given as examples of ignorance would be religious belief or different forms of bigotry, racism, sexism, and so on. These would be examples that we would see in atheism and scientific materialism of how we ignore reality, how it really is, and move into a state of ignorance. And again, the process whereby energy manifests through agency and existence into reality and ignorance is the process of creation. And in each moment, and indeed at the end of time, there will be a great destruction when the universe comes to an end. And reality will be destroyed and will, in effect, go back to being just pure energy again. And the universe as we know it will come to an end. So again, here we see an example of the diamond model in a way of looking at things which is not religious or not spiritual at all.
Thank you, Nishad. I'm going to take a slight privilege as the host here, and instead of breaking for a discussion, I'm going to show the last slide that I wanted to talk about, healing the city, because I think it pulls the whole set together. I have had, like Peter, a series of other discussions with Nishad. And as I mentioned, one of the reasons I was so intrigued with his diamond model was that it helped me see how to consider, can we heal the city with such a multiplicity of perspectives and beliefs? And so in this representation of a way to think about that, using the diamond model, using a variation of my map 5, I would say we would start off in a place of mutual respect. So this would be where we're embracing commonalities and differences. And we could say, as many of you know who have looked at my work, I'm always trying to hold the city as a whole. So if we allow for our ground of being to be represented by mutual respect, we could say perhaps that ecumenism is a way of enacting the whole. And certainly the World Unity Week is a way to really knit together, weave together many different belief systems. And we are trying to reach and find what does unity mean. So I would say this is one way of saying it's enacting the whole. That going back to a great influence that David Bohm had around dialogue, we could say that one of the things that we need is intersubjective dialogue. And here we would have individuals and collectives, I think, if we were going to continue to draw the diagram. Nishad and I have had lots of back and forth around how to frame a whole series of the ones that we did on just the city. And that included even this one. But I had just heard yesterday on World Unity Week, actually a Humanity Rising session that was on dialogue, and they were practicing Bohmian dialogue. So they had the individuals and the collective, and they were really trying to discern what was in the field, what was in the probably the subtle realm that they were sharing. And so when that dialogue is not listened to, when we don't have mutual respect, then we actually go into incredible fragmentation, and we get tectonic shifts between belief systems, we get anger, we get trauma with all of the huge challenges that our ways of believing have led us into in the world. Then in order to work our way back into a place where we can hold the whole, I think we need to heal, to educate, integrate. We need to bring alignment and coherence back to the parts. So here's another way we could frame that, that it is not just involution, but agape, compassion. So compassion is greatly explored in many of the realms that I'm in and Findhorn these days, and also I think elsewhere on World Unity Week. And that our evolutionary path is characterized through eros, through the experience and expression of love. So this slide I just wanted to bring in to sort of complete the slide set that we have here of exploring a way of looking at wholeness in belief systems that Nishad has really opened up and discerned, I think, very wonderful universal patterns in the diamond model, looking at the history from Bohm, and then actually exploring through all the different clusters of the faith systems. And then Peter himself bringing in a really powerful image of how this relates to the evolution and the toroidal energy flow that comes through the system. So I'd like to invite Peter to come back on, and I've stopped sharing my PowerPoint. And Nishad and Peter, just let's open up our trialogue between us, and any comments that you have on what you've just seen now as our cluster of archetypes, of patterns, and our own ways of interpreting them. Nishad, would you like to start?
Yes, I think the potential power of this approach would be to really demonstrate this underlying coherence that does exist across the traditions. And I think it's this inability to see this coherence that is at the root of the conflict that we see between the different traditions. If I belong to a particular tradition, say I'm a Christian and somebody else is a Muslim or a Hindu, we see ourselves in opposition to one another because we perceive ourselves as believing in radically different things. If this insight or perception could somehow arise that those differences, while there are differences which we must honor, those differences are not the whole story. In some way, those differences are even on the surface. But if we can look beneath these differences in language and culture and history, which is what has led to these surface differences, there is a far more powerful, deeper unity that underlies the traditions in ways that most of us have never even thought of, or it hasn't even occurred to most people, because we're so conditioned, if you like, to think in terms of different religions, different worldviews, and we have to choose one that we must believe in and join and defend and promote. And that's exactly the kind of fragmentation that leads to all these problems that we're talking about. So if somehow this insight of underlying unity can become more deeply explored and more deeply well known, then there is, I think, some glimmer of a hope that we can find a way beyond this fragmentation that is so obviously there. And this underlying unity shouldn't really be a surprise, because we're all living in the same universe, apparently, allegedly. So great founders and great sages and great mystics, you wouldn't expect them to really be coming up with all these radically contradictory views. That would be very odd. It actually makes much more sense that they're all perceiving the same underlying truth, but expressing it in different ways because of their own belief systems, their own place in history, their own culture, their own preferences. So I think if we can somehow really consolidate this insight and make it better known, then there is some kind of path to unity opens up, I think.
Yeah, thank you. It's like I hear you telling the story of diversity and unity in diversity. I put a link to a blog that I wrote after our series of interviews, where I imagined this somewhere like 100 years or 1,000 years in the future, and looking backcasting to how we actually do manage to move forward and discover, because our life conditions force us to look for a different way of noticing how we can be together. Peter, you have explored this kind of diversity and unity and diversity in many ways. So I invite you to just bring in your comments.
Yeah, I think the key is going to be around what Nishad described, is to make sure that that we honor the parts, even as we point to the interconnectedness. So if the message comes in was, look, you're all the same, basically, look, same thing, then they're going to get massive resistance, and people won't feel that their story is being honored. So the key is going to be to because essentially what we're talking about is the religions have moved from part to fragment, right? That they've lost sight of the context, but that doesn't mean that the part isn't valid. That's a particular cultural or historical interpretation of the core pattern that Nishad and I described underlying it. If those are the basic dynamics of life, the basic elements as Nishad described it, the basic dynamics as I described it, then it's normal that different cultures have historically presenced them in different ways and created a different story around them. And so it's important to make sure that that story, whichever religious story it is validated, and the message doesn't come across from, oh, it's all the same, we need to kind of forget it. But remember that, that each of those stories is really important to uplift, and remember the context of it being one particular expression of an underlying truth. That's going to be the challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Peter. And as we're talking, I'm just going to invite our audience, if they have any questions, to put them in the chat or to raise your hand so that we could invite you into the conversation too. So, Peter, in responding to what you just said,
Marilyn, I had a question for you, actually.
Oh, okay. I'll hold my comment.
Yeah, cool. Which is, so, you know, if we're talking about this Trinity where you've got the let's say the gross and the subtle and the causal, right? In a city, obviously nearly all the attention goes to the gross, to all the parts and things. And yet, if we follow this pattern, if we agree that there is this pattern with a whole and a part, or, you know, in the Trinity as I described it, then it would mean that the city has somewhere some unified field that defines its ultimate identity, and that there is also a kind of subtle dynamic going on between that and how the city manifests to our five senses. Do you recognize that? And how would you describe that in terms of can you indeed describe a city as an entity in that way?
Yes, well, I do, Peter. Thanks for the question. So, I mean, I think of a city as having all those three elements that you described: a container, manifestation, dynamics. So this is why I, for a long time, was trying to figure out how do you represent spirituality in the city when there is so many different expressions of it. And I think that what we can remember is that historically, most of those faith systems came up in human settlements where it was much more homogeneous. Those settlements had arisen within the life conditions, so the container would have been a response to those life conditions. But in mostly the lifetimes of the people on this session, we've created these cosmopolis cities where all the faith traditions of the world are present and trying to coexist with each other. I have recognized that for a long time, and I actually have thought that this is where new governance will come from, because we're going to have to figure it out. So when we look at map 5, when we look at the diamond model, when we look at the Trinity archetypes, then I think we see the patterns that we can notice in the city. And we know that we're in a stage of transition where they're not all recognized as coherent, where they're not all recognized as mirroring the same pattern. So I see the possibility of that. And I guess I would add in one other factor that you would be very familiar with, is that who we are in this city, our own capacities, our own developmental levels and perspectives and worldviews really are what help us to interpret what we know and believe. And we're not all at those same shared worldviews or levels of development. So in addition to having the three elements of your Trinity, we have a lot of dynamics going on where people have egocentric views, ethnocentric views, regional centric views, and global centric views. And I just finished writing a whole series of blogs about the complications of that. Yeah. So does that?
So when that diversity, well, I guess what we're saying is that diversity is now fragmented because of the lack of awareness of the whole.
Yeah.
So when we ask ourselves, what is the whole in the city?
Yeah.
There is one of our teachers who's inspired both of us, I know, and others on this call, Dr. Don Beck, would talk about the need for having a superordinate goal.
Yes.
To be able to transcend all of that diversity, where each of the parts realizes that they could achieve something far greater and their own identity be uplifted if they were to work towards this superordinate goal of this particular city, let's say, and that they couldn't do it on their own, that they would need these other religious groups or these other parts of the city. So I'm just trying to explore, like, what does it mean to bring the awareness of the whole back into the parts of a city so that they become, contributive parts rather than destructive fragments, as we so often see at the moment? And is it to do with this idea of a superordinate goal or some sense of collective identity or purpose that would transcend, yet of course include and uplift all of the parts?
Yeah, I think that, Peter, one of the challenges I ask people is not to just think like a city, so stand in the shoes of the city, but think like a planet who has multiple organs. And so Lovelock calls humans Gaia's reflective organs. And I said, I thought cities were the organs. And so each of those organs has different purposes in service to Gaia. And so within a city, I would say that discovering that purpose would give us the superordinate goal of what we could all serve towards and serve Gaia's well-being. So yeah.
Have you found that like cities seem to have their own like almost personality or identity somehow, maybe to do with how they were founded initially? So you could
absolutely.
Yeah?
Absolutely. They all have lineages. I consider that there is such a thing as a city spirit. I think it's accessible through various approaches like systemic constellation work. So I absolutely, and those voices have voices. They do speak. Yeah. So I think the archetypes are not just theory, not just what we either put on 2D or 3D. I think they're real. My experience of them is they're very real. Yeah. Nishad, you had something, you look like you're wanting to comment, maybe what Peter was saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important point about the dynamic of development here that I think you both brought in, because if this understanding of the underlying unity is to be understood, we could see that happening much more easily with thought leaders or religious communities that are already progressive in their orientation. I think the deeper challenge would be, how do we, or do we indeed, get across this insight of unity to individuals or groups that have a much more conservative or even fundamentalist view of life and their own religious tradition? I mean, is that even possible, or how could we work towards that? Or is it up to the more progressive elements of society to recognize this unity, but also be able to contain those elements that are not yet able to recognize that unity?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so Peter was saying, like, do I see this, what he was asking in cities? Well, yes, in in some progressive cities, but I would also think about what you're asking, Nishad. Often Don Beck would point to Singapore as an example of a city that was created from the beginning with multiple faith traditions and actually had agreements to recognize all of the religious holidays, to really have, I think, a recognition that each one of them must respect the other. They could practice as they saw they were called to, but on the condition that they were not impeding the other practices. And I think that's what the mutual respect requires if we had all of the faith traditions able to do that. I think in addition to progressive cities, we have progressive practitioners within each faith tradition. And so I'm familiar with and have had some experience of intercity ecumenism, where the leaders of the faith traditions get together, and many of them are very progressive. And they try to find ways so that those who are at a more traditional worldview and level of development are able to practice, but without endangering others or disrespecting others. And that's probably the most challenging thing for us to get into our practices as humans, is to allow for the differences long enough that the differences can make a difference. So I think that is one of the challenges. Yeah. Peter, do you have anything else that you would wanted to say?
Yeah, must be the spirit of Don Beck that's kind of moving in between us now, because it made me think of, his assimilation contrast effect. Right. I just managed to find it actually, so maybe I can just show it briefly. But like Marilyn was, you've got this within each religious stream, you are going to have more progressives, more moderns, and let's say what Don would call the flamethrowers or the zealots. So the people who are not going to negotiate with any other religion or tolerate them, whatever. And his point was that if you are wanting to actually make progress and do what Marilyn was just describing, namely have a kind of ecumenical, world of religions dialogue, etc., then you may well have to find a way to contain the flamethrowers and zealots so that they don't sabotage the attempts at relationship between the different religions. And because when they start to do that, what they do is they pull the progressives, let's say, they kind of create more polarization in the system, take away the middle ground. And so that's tough, particularly if you look at places like the Netherlands that have, where I live, that have a great tradition of tolerance and respect, and to be able to make that differentiation between, say, a zealotism that is not going to sit at the table and be constructive, whatever, and actually consciously choose to repress that or contain it in some way so that it doesn't destroy the rest, is very hard for the postmodern mindset to accept as a possibility, because it wants to include everybody in the dialogue and has developmental naivety in terms of an understanding that you have got egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric, and an ethnocentric intention, if it loses its context, and this is where it becomes fragmented, which we often see rather than apart, can be very destructive. So there's this, that makes the challenge particularly complex.
Yeah, and I think that we happen to be living through an age of transition where the complexity is not going to get any less. And I remember in listening to Don Beck talk about the assimilation contrast effect, was that it was the job of the progressives to control the zealots on their side. So it wasn't an expectation that somebody outside that belief system would do that work. It was that group getting together and saying, if we wish to be of greatest service, then we need to put some limitations around the zealots. And these days, that is not an easy challenge, because we know the zealots have many different ways, from social media to actual terrorism to physical threats, to actually cause mayhem. I guess maybe what I would like to just put out as a last comment, and then maybe we can do a closing round, is with something like the archetype, the diamond model that Nishad has shown us, then I think we have something to share amongst at least the progressives, and that we probably need to come up with our agreements about how we do respect one another, how we do set limits, and how we deal with the most difficult challenges. It's a bit like family support systems. And one of the reasons that I love to use systemic constellation work is it reveals the invisible that is available for us to give insights both from our lineages, our ancestors, and even the future that's emerging. So I think those possibilities are embedded in both the diamond model and your Trinity model as well, Peter. So I can see from our time that we should probably do a closing round. I haven't seen any questions from the chat or no raised hands, unless anybody else has. Yeah. And there's a raised hand from John. Go ahead, John, unmute yourself.
I've hesitated to raise my hand because there's so much that's great about everything that you've shared, and so much that is unified, that coming in and saying anything that is more than a question feels difficult. But I do have a kind of fundamental challenge with where all these models land, which is that there's a certain level at which they, for me, they actually miss what's really happening in my perception inside the field. They miss something about the relationship between information and dynamics, if I was to take it at a conceptual level. What do we really mean when we talk about information? Because we talk about information as if it's a kind of a result rather than actually the nature of the causative field itself. And if the information is the nature of the causative field itself, and it's within us as well as in the universe, then there's a whole question about the dynamics of how we work with that, which I kind of feel we can't even begin to explore. It needs another few hours, which clearly we don't have. But it feels important to me that actually the conversation became real in the last 10 or 15 minutes, because we started beginning to get into the stuff that's in Spiral about why people think the way they think and how that affects the nature of the conversation that we're having, and the relationship between kind of what it means to create an overarching goal and what goes underneath that in terms of our individual and collective relationship with the field of information in how we all create and perceive reality, that is required in order to work and deliver that shift. So I'm kind of slightly frustrated that I feel we didn't get actually to the core of it, even with all the wonderful models, that there was a level that was missing of the reality that we're dealing with.
Yeah, thanks, John. Very delighted that you come in and give us that challenge. And you're right, it opens up a whole other series of conversations that we could have. And it doesn't mean we can't have them just because we're coming to the end of our time here. As Peter and Nishad have had a series of interviews, and Nishad and I, maybe we need to have a quartet and explore the challenge that you put out to us. And I think it's very real. I mean, one of the ways I would encapsulate it is meeting people where they're at, and being able to engage with the real challenges, especially in the city. That is where all the major challenges of the world, all of our big challenges exist and have to be resolved. So thank you for the question and the provocation, and maybe we can use that as a segue to go for closing comments of not only what we explored, and our intention here was to put out the patterns of the faith communities in the city, and I hadn't expected us to be able to resolve the kind of question that you raised, but it's lovely to have you recognize that that is embedded in what we explored. So thank you. So I'd like to invite Nishad for a closing comment, and then Peter.
Well, thank you. Yes, I think I'll just say a couple of things. First of all, I think fragmentation, as we've been discussing, it's very real, and that fragmentation in our perception lies at the root of many of the problems that we see. And if we can somehow understand ourselves and get across some kind of understanding of how fragmentation can move into multiplicity through an understanding of some underlying wholeness, I think that would be a very good way forward. I completely agree with what John has said. There is this extra dynamic of different people being at different levels of development, and what actually can different levels of development actually perceive. Because a lot of worldviews are going to exist out there which are going to simply not be able to accept or acknowledge anything that we're talking about here. So with that qualification, I think we've taken that first small step to trying to discover if there really is a unity beneath it all. And I think the next steps in the journey would be to take on John's challenge and to find out how we can really communicate that and get that across, given this other dynamic that we haven't really brought in today, which is the dynamic of development.
Thank you, Nishad. Peter.
Thanks. Yeah, in a way, it is just beginning. I mean, I'm reading Nancy's comments. So why can't all people agree with this? And then, of course, we get into a spiral and everything else. That article, Nancy, I put a link to earlier, the assimilation contrast effect of memenomics. That's a good place to start to explore anyway. Yeah, and it's funny, just before John came in, I was thinking, okay, maybe I'll finish off by talking about information and dynamics. And but then that was kind of going to open a big wormhole, because you know, ultimately, if we're going to start to work with the bigger container and the dynamics, then we need to start to be engaging with the subtle realms beyond just the material that we can see. So the question is, how do you go about that? So I agree with, you know, John, in a way. What the maps do is, if we resonate with the maps have implications. And the question is, what are those implications? Okay, so if we want to bring in the whole and we want to start working with the container, which is apparently information, there's all this subtle stuff going on, then how do you work with that at a city level, for example? And it is possible. I mean, the practices like Marilyn mentioned, like the systemic work, or like eco-intention, for example, where you get to work with the system as a whole. It's all of it's possible. But we haven't, you know, that's like a cliffhanger at the end of a chapter, you know, come back for the next session and maybe we'll be able to do something about that. But it's a great Pandora's box of very exciting stuff. Yeah, let's leave it there for now. And thanks for hosting us, Marilyn.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And I think you brought the right image, Pandora's box. But that is a lot of the ways that people do think about cities as Pandora's box, and there's just no way to understand what's inside. So I really appreciate that both you and Nishad have dared to explore archetypes and energies and the subtle realms in ways that open doors for that to be possible, both in archetypal ways, theoretical ways, and myself, I'm always trying to practice it. So I've used much of what I've learned to be in the map 5, in the diamond model, in the Trinity perspectives, in my actual on the ground work in cities. And it's because I've dared to pull back the veil that I've been able to see things that haven't been there before. So I appreciate that you were willing to take the step today and on World Unity Week, bring, I think, some real pioneering work that gives a whole new way to engage with not only the faith positions, spirituality, but I think the big challenges that we face in the world. So thank you both. Thank you to our audience. And thank you to World Unity Week for sponsoring the session. Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.